Hey folks, welcome to episode 7 of Cleaning Code with Doc Norton. I'm still Doc Norton. In episode 7, we're going to take a step back for a little bit. We spent the last 6 episodes working on the removal of File Manager from JDepend. And in this episode, we're going to spend a little bit of time drawing up a test file. It's going to be a little bit of lightweight fun. So let's get into it. We're going to spend our time in class file parser test today. As we move through this, I'm really just going through and kind of looking at each of the tests. And one of the things I've noticed is they have a lot of asserts, and they're actually quite similar. Every single one of them has a class file name that it's checking. Every single one of them asserts whether or not it's an inner class. Every single one of them goes through and asserts whether or not there are classes that are referenced inside of those class files, etc. So at first glance, these tests look very different from one another, or significantly different from one another, and it turns out that they're actually pretty much the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by extracting out what are the things in these tests that differ from one to the other. So for example, they all use a different class name. So let's go ahead and extract that out. All right, now, some of these classes are abstract and some of them are not. When we're doing the asserts in the original set of tests, we're asserting true or asserting false. I want to change that. We're going to make it an assert equals, and we're going to pass in true or false. While we're at it, we're going to make a local variable called isAbstract, and we're going to assign it to that either true or false value. We're going to move all of these common variables to the top of each of the tests. All of this is basically setting us up to dry this whole thing up. And that about wraps that one up. And it turns out that every single one of these tests has a series of asserts that are basically checking to see if the imports that come back in the class, match, contains this particular class. And what I want to do is let's take all of the classes that we're checking and let's move them into a collection and then iterate through that collection. So basically every single one of these tests now will have a collection of expected classes that it iterates through and confirms that those classes are in the final result. This again sets us up for a larger refactoring that will really dry this whole thing up. All right, so here we're just doing a little bit of cleanup to create our collection, basically taking our original assert true statements and converting all that to a list by using the arrays as list. Test passes. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and actually create the for loop out of that new collection. Also notice I changed the assert equals of a hard-coded size to now the expected imports class size should be the size of the classes we've imported. Now we're going to go through the expected imports. We're going to pull out each package, and we're going to assert that that package is inside of the imports that came back. You notice I've got a compile time error here, and in a second what's going to happen is I will actually go back up the challenges. I don't want this to be an object, which I'm doing right now. What I want is the exports themselves to be of type Java package. So it took me a second to figure that out, but there we go. Let's go back down here. Let's get rid of object, and I should change it back to Java package so it's explicit, and that should run. Okay, now we're going to need to do this for all of the other tests. All right, now that that's done, let's take our expected imports local variable in each one of these tests. Let's just move it up to the top. We're placing it next to the other local variables that we've been declaring, which are basically variables that hold the differences between all of these tests. Again, setting ourselves up for the larger refactoring here that will dry up all these tests. Now, it turns out the name of the class does not always match the name of the file that it's in. So we're also going to go ahead and pull out the name of the source file and move that up to the top. This, I believe, is the final difference between all of these tests, and we are now set for the next big step of the refactoring. All right, this sets us up for the big next step. So all of our variables are isolated at the top of each of the methods, and it turns out that the bottom half of all of these methods is actually identical. So we're now able to abstract that out into its own single method, drying up a bunch of this duplicate code, duplicate logic. So we go ahead and grab that code, do a simple extract method refactoring. Let's give it a decent name. Replace all, and that should run. All right, very good. Let's just go ahead and take a look at our validate parser. Let's just tighten this up a little bit. It's got a bunch of blank lines that are unnecessary. And that should finish up that extract method. All right, now this next step may be unnecessary, but I noticed something here and I wanted to show this refactoring. If we look at validate parser, it receives 4 different parameters. All of those parameters basically define the class file. They are criteria for the class file that we're going to validate. So what I want to do is take those 4 parameters and actually run a refactoring to introduce a parameter object. Now we got to give this thing a name. So let's make it an inner class. And let's go ahead, how about class file criteria? It is the criteria for the class file. Let's go ahead and do that refactoring. And what we're going to notice here is no problem, it does it. If we go look at each of our calling methods now, what ends up happening is they've all called validate parser, and then they do a new class criteria. So let's go ahead and pull that up and out. And we can start inlining all of these localized variables. We really don't need those holders anymore, and just kind of tighten this up, clean it up a little bit more. All right, so let's recap where we are and a little bit of where we came from. So here we are looking at class file parser test. We have dried this up quite a bit. Basically, we now indicate what we expect the imports to be. We create a class file criteria class, passing in class name, source file name, whether or not it's supposed to be abstract, and what imports we expected, and then we go ahead and call our validate parser. Validate parser is now obviously the same for all of them. Still not a huge fan of this. I don't like one test that has 1, 2, 3, as many as a dozen asserts all in the same test. But this is what we inherited, and so this is where we are. It's at least a little bit cleaner. And the class file criteria is just an inner class. We don't need to move that anywhere. Right now, it's only being used here anyway. And it's fairly thin and fairly straightforward. So just kind of as a reminder, let's pop over here for a second and let's check out episode 6. Nope. Go. And we can see what it was before. All right, each one of these tests has all of this stuff inside of it. So let's see here. 185 lines. I'm willing to bet we actually made it longer, but I think we made it more readable. Let's go back to episode 7. Yep, I think it's cleaner, much more readable. We've isolated all of the behavior, but we did in fact make it longer. All right, so that's the end of this episode, episode 7. Nice little respite, a little bit of a break. What I want to start doing in the next episode is I want to go back here to kind of the core of things, Java Class Builder. We've been playing around in here a little bit because we effectively replaced File Manager with class containers. What I want to start looking at is this whole build method and build classes especially. This thing's just funky. The collection that it receives has some class files, some jar files. We have different versions of it. It calls itself. I just think there's a lot of opportunity to clean this up, and I believe that a lot of this responsibility can actually move into a different area of the application. So episode 8, we're going to start taking a look at this. Cool. So that wraps up episode 7. I'm trying to make these a little bit shorter. I'm trying to make them a little more crisp. You might have noticed some changes in the editing, considering maybe even using a green screen. We'll see what happens there. If you're enjoying these, please give them the thumbs up. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And as I indicated, we'll get back to doing some real work in episode 8. I'll see you then.